Hi, I'm Sarah Glassberg.
I'm Brad Pilcher.
And this is AJFF in Conversation, the Jewish Film Podcast.
With our 21st annual AJFF in the rearview mirror, we are not only looking ahead to year-round programs and planning 2022, we're also evaluating what it meant for us to even be able to put on a festival in a pandemic in the first place.
It's certainly a hot topic for many festivals who have had to pivot to virtual or hybrid models over the past year. And it continues to pose new questions and challenges even now as the vaccine rollout continues and movie theaters begin to reopen.
Which is why we wanted to hear from our special guest today about his own reflections, experiences, and opinions about film festivals in the time of COVID. And he should have a lot to say since his festival is just around the corner.
That's right. Chris Escobar is the executive director of the Atlanta Film Society, whose 45th edition of the Atlanta Film Festival kicks off this week. The festival itself is one of the largest and longest running in the region and is one of only 24 Academy Award qualifying festivals in the U.S.
Chris, we're excited to have you with us today to talk film festivals during these crazy times, but also specifically your festival and what audiences can expect and look forward to. Thanks for taking the time today.
Well, thanks for having me.
I'm going to jump right in with my first question because there's a lot to cover in this area. What trends do you see happening as far as putting on festivals in COVID times? Are there any particular themes and trends that you've seen that might stay post-pandemic? Are they better or worse? I mean, what's your take on that?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, we've seen some festivals cancel outright, a number be strictly virtual, and then a number be able to have some kind of outdoor component, being a drive-in component or a socially distanced kind of lawn screening. You know, there's not been a lot of festivals that have started to venture back indoors, but and I think rightly so. I think it's still, there's a lot of uncertainty and stuff, but I think in terms of trends that I think will maybe stick around post-pandemic is the ability to reach folks not just restricted to their geographic communities and be able to really prioritize having virtual programming available, at least as a parallel. I've got to say, personally, I had always felt like having things available online parallel to in-person really kind of pulls the steam out of being in the room and offers more options. And at least for our area, it's always felt like, you know, if people have more options, they're going to wait and put off, you know, and, you know, if there's multiple screenings scheduled or that kind of thing, it kind of takes the immediacy out. But, you know, necessity is the driver here. And we've had to, you know, do these virtual things. And I think amongst all the kind of reckonings there's been and realizations for inequities and things, I think the fact that we've all been forcibly, by and large, stuck at home and had to experience the world that way, it's I'll say, at least for me personally, it's given me a sense of what it's like for people who have had to experience the world from home before COVID was dominating our lives. And so I think realizing that we kind of leave those folks out of the equation and experiencing that firsthand, I think is something that is going to stick with me and with our organization, and realizing that, you know, when we can create access for folks who are homebound, even when COVID is hopefully behind us, we recognize it's not just, you know, people who maybe don't want to come, but people who are unable to come, and creating that access, I think, is one of a few things that I think is going to be hopefully sticking around.
Yeah, that accessibility around virtual is important. It's something that we saw at the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival was a huge part of this year's experience. But I want to actually jump back a bit to that first trend that you mentioned was drive-in. Drive-in was a real challenge for us. It's an incredibly expensive thing to do. The Atlanta Film Festival has perhaps been one of the more successful festivals at incorporating drive-in across its programming. I think part of that is that you have a venue that is a little bit easier to pull that off. But I mean, what are the challenges around that as a film festival? Is it sustainable to try to do that kind of drive-in programming long term?
I don't think drive-ins are going to be a big I don't think they're going to go away and be as gone as they were before COVID, but I don't think they're going to be a significant factor long term. I mean, they're going to be around as long as COVID's around. I'll say that, as are other kinds of outdoor screening. And yeah, part of the reason why we were able to do that successfully is, you know, in common, first of all, the Film Society, you know, has a 40 plus year history of working in non-traditional spaces. I mean, we were born in the bathhouse of Piedmont Park, for crying out loud. And so thinking non-traditionally and making spaces work and creating experiences kind of part of our DNA. I do, in addition to, aside from being the executive director of the Atlanta Film Society, I own the Plaza Theater, and we were one of the first movie theaters in the country to pivot back in May of last year and do not one, but 2 drive-ins, one there at the rear of the Plaza Theater and the other one in partnership with Dad's Garage. And so we've been running drive-ins for almost a year now during a pandemic. And we were able to mount the first ever indoor drive-in during the Atlanta Film Festival, and that was a whole other venture. But yeah, for us, I mean, I think part of why that's worked is, for one, scale. We're not trying to do drive-ins that have hundreds of people, because that, even if you can, from a presentation standpoint, make that work, it does start to involve other challenges, when you're thinking about functionalities of bathroom or things like that. And when you're juggling that many people on scale during a pandemic, it's just not a thing I've been wanting to venture into. And so the fact that we've had these smaller, 40 car, 50 car drive-ins have meant that it's always a much more manageable size broken up, and that we can just do that with repetition rather than trying to do that in a large scale. One of the things that's going to be a first is doing a sort of for at least during a pandemic. We've keep in mind, this is going to be our 3rd film festival during the pandemic. And in the last 7 months, we've done, between the Atlanta Film Festival having it pushed back to September last year, and then we hosted Sundance in January, February.
I don't know what you guys were thinking trying to pull all of that off in 7 months. I mean, it's such a compressed time.
We were thinking we hate sleep and we hate seeing our families, and we just want to work to the bone. No.
Your wife and kids really appreciate it.
Exactly. No, I mean, part of it is a stopgap. I mean, we didn't want to have the ripple effect of, and then push the 2021 festival also back and that kind of stuff. When we had scheduled both the 2020 festival and the 2021 Atlanta Film Festival, having Sundance in the middle of that was not part of the equation. And unfortunately, that was, sort of largely planned, and it's kind of a, you're either involved with this or you're not. And so, yeah, and, but it, if anything, it really gave us confidence in the things that we knew would work. And the things that also, part of this has also been not trying to bend over backwards to do things that really don't create that much impact right now, and realizing what are the things that are okay to let go of a little bit, and what are the things that are important to emphasize on. So, it's been a lot of that, but I've got to say, I'm very much looking forward to after the film festival, and we have a full year of producing major film festivals in between. That's going to seem awesome.
We're all both in the film festival or film industry, but just even personally, we're all being kept on our toes. It sounds like between the industry things that come up like Sundance, those opportunities, seizing on those, but also as recent as very recently, we get these daily updates on reopening plans for the state, and we're all just kind of pivoting almost on a daily basis. So you just started to talk about some learnings and takeaways, it sounded like, from 2020 that kind of helped shape this year's edition, but are there others that you'd like to talk about, from having to postpone, as you said, then, even this drive-in question, how has drive-in and a return to the Plaza Theater changed for the 2021 festival and been kind of impacted by everything that you kind of went through in 2020?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I could say, for one, it's altered my my sense of sort of outlook, and like going in March and going into, April, and before we even started the drive-ins, my perspective was, if I can just, solve for every point and figure everything out, then it'll be solved and it'll be good, and then life will be easy. And that, was the perspective of someone who just did not do enough events outside, for one. Because between aside from just creating an operating guideline for, okay, if the forecast looks like this, here's the threshold of where we're comfortable moving forward, that sort of thing. It's still going to go against forecast. Even an hour out, the weather will change on a dime. And then, we had, when we were in the whole summer, kind of was a testing ground largely for the what was the September Film Festival. I mean, we lost days to operating due to, curfews placed by the city. I mean, so anytime I felt like I had it figured out, the universe reminded me that I don't. And it, is very humbling. And certainly there's a lot of, it can become easy to take comfort in, okay, we've put all this work in, and we've got all this figured out. And so there's nothing else we could possibly consider. And then sort of take comfort in that, and then just be so distraught when life throws a curveball at you. And so if anything, it's just given me this perspective of all I need to do is come up with the best plan for where I am now, and start to imagine what are the other very different, very possible, curveballs that could get thrown my way, and how I might either change things or realize that something might have to just not happen if those circumstances create that. And so it's meant that, I'm still planning a lot, and I'm still kind of thinking about these scenarios, but I'm also managing my own expectations, that just because I'm going to do everything I'm planning on doing doesn't mean that every variable is within my control. And I've got to, know that up front, that, this stuff might either happen differently at a different time, or not at all, based on any number of these circumstances, and the ones I can't even imagine. So it's a little bit of, a philosophy change, I would say. But in terms of, learnings, there's been some things like, what are the simple little things that we can do that can make it a little bit of a sense of occasion, but also not hold that so high that it's somehow going to transform or change or make everything make sense, either from a financial standpoint or an impact standpoint, that it's worth, crazy tons of money and tons of energy. Like if we can do something that's a simple thing that'll, I'll give you a very, very tiny little, for instance, like we made these little, these, a fun part of going to a film festival for a lot of art guests anyway, is being able to, take photos in front of the step and repeat and stuff like that. And so that starts to can get a little sticky, when you're inviting people to be gathering and, and that kind of stuff. And so we made these little these selfie boards that we would bring to folks' cars, and they can take a little selfie in their own car. And that's a little fun, simple thing. Doesn't really take a lot of money, doesn't really take a lot of time, but is a fun enhancement. Doing something as simple as making sure that we, do welcoming remarks before the screening. And it's not just, okay, you're here, you're settled in, let's start the movie. Or let's start the pre-show, and making everything purely video based, when such a higher percentage of our interaction with other humans is so video based. Realizing something as simple as a real live person, giving welcoming remarks and that kind of stuff. I mean, these are little things that end up kind of do make a big difference. And so those are some of the, for instances, that I can think of off the top of my head.
Screen fatigue is a real thing. It extends to the movie screen too. I want to jump back to something that you brought up earlier that I think is going to be important for film festivals. I know it's going to be important for AJFF. I would imagine it will be for the Atlanta Film Festival. Is there's a tension between the increased accessibility of virtual that you talked about, that I think all of us were really, really happy to see in this year. But at the same time, as you said, it does have a quality that takes a little bit away from the live experience, even if maybe it's cannibalizing the audience a little bit. Maybe it's just taking some of the energy from people who would be in the room when they're not in the room, they're at their houses. How do you, as a programmer, how do you think that film festivals can try to tackle that tension, try to overcome that sort of inherent challenge of incorporating a virtual component into film festivals going forward?
I will say, for one, kind of the future of that is going to be decided by forces larger than any of us, right? So those are going to be things largely duked out by the studios and exhibitors and things like that. And even as an exhibitor myself, I realize I only have so much sway in that conversation. But I think if virtual screenings can, instead of just be wide open, when we did the model during Sundance, where it still had a liveness. It was at a scheduled time. And that was when you also got to see like the virtual Q&A. And then those numbers are capped. It's not unlimited. So, there isn't also a sense of immediacy. It also protects, frankly, the future, commercial, appeal of that film when it's not this potential unlimited number of people that can watch it via a film festival. Because the film festivals are not supposed to be, kind of letting all the cat out of the commercial bag, so to speak, right? They're supposed to be cultural events, a means where there's a bit of an equalizer where, independents, films made by folks with no recognizable names are a bit of on an equal playing field as these larger films. They're cultural events, they're competitive events as well. And then to an extent also, what is the viability of this film from a commercial standpoint? What's the interest that, this film might garner from not only just in general, but maybe from the audience that this film festival has in this market and that sort of thing. And so, being able to set some parameters around that, I think creates some comfort, creates for the distributor or the rights holder, it creates some immediacy for the audience to realize like, I'll just decide in the last minute or whatever, and then forget about it. And, I think it puts a little bit of some guardrails, so to speak. And so I think doing that really helps, where you still have that accessibility part and at the same time you're not kind of letting all the wind out of your own sails. But we also got to realize that and this is a challenge we've also been giving onto ourselves is aside from accessibility from a you can watch the film at home standpoint, there's also an accessibility from an accommodation standpoint. So for instance, like, when you come see a movie at the theater, you can get, hearing impaired or vision impaired devices that can help that viewing experience. And then you can partake with everyone else there. To put something available virtually, especially with these independent titles, that a lot of the work in terms of creating captions or subtitles or all this kind of assistant stuff is normally done with a distributor. And so if you're working with a lot of titles that don't yet have a distributor, how do you bridge that gap and trying to make sure that there's as much accessibility as possible from that standpoint? And what kind of role that might mean that a film festival maybe has to come in and try and help supplement. And so we've kind of established, in formalizing our Atlanta Film Festival Access Program, which is normally a vehicle for which we provide low or free admission for schools and for community groups and things like that. It's also a small fund that can help underwrite the filmmakers to be able to use these services that can create these captions. Now that film is leaving the festival better, not only from maybe what visibility it's got in our audience, but now they have a component that makes their film that much more attractive to a distributor where they've already got captions made and that sort of thing. Maybe we're helping them make their DCP or whatnot, so that it makes theatrical exhibition more possible. So we're trying to think about it from those standpoints as well.
Yeah, that was a huge issue for us. I know we asked films to provide captions if they had them, but virtually nobody had them. And that's we don't caption the films in the theater. They're subtitled if they're in a foreign language, but it's remarkable how many people at home are used to watching films with captions turned on, and without doing that work that you talk about, we're not in a position to provide that. Something that's a major thing to think about for festivals going forward.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing is, as consumers, we're trained by what these multi-million-dollar operations put out there for worldwide audiences. We don't realize how much money and time goes into preparing things for the kind of worldwide distribution and exhibition there is. And so for us on the sort of arts nonprofit side, where we're trying to reconcile the differences between this filmmaker who doesn't yet have a distributor, and there hasn't been, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars in prints and advertising costs, that preps it for that worldwide exhibition. And then we as the community-based presenters are trying to reconcile that gap between what the audience expects or is just used to and what we have to work with. I mean, that's a big gap.
Yeah, audience expectations is such a huge part of this too, because I know that when we did the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, people really did come to it and they kind of had expectations that were being set by Netflix. And we had to kind of say, look, that's not what we are. That's not what we're able to deliver. It's not what we're even trying to deliver. And we also had to try to explain to our audience how much of this stuff is dictated by the distributor. So we can't just take these films and put them up for the entire run of the festival. There's seating. I mean, people were shocked when some of our film films sold out because they're like, how could it possibly sell out? It's a virtual. I said, well, there's caps that have been put on us by the distributors. And that's a major communications thing that film festivals, I think, are going to have to do, because it's uncharted territory for audiences who are savvy to festivals traditionally. They're not necessarily savvy, at $1 billion level, but the audiences, even those who have attended lots and lots of film festivals, they just don't know what it's going to be like for film festivals operating virtually, because most film festivals have not previously operated virtually. So, I mean, that's just part of the conversation.
If anything, it underlines the reason why film festivals need to exist. Because look, these mega corporations, be it Netflix or Apple or Amazon or Disney or Warner Brothers, whatever, there's a reason why we have a representation problem. And it's because they only sink these millions of dollars into the films and the platforms for which they believe they could make tens of millions of dollars on. And so the films that aren't easy to market and that don't have broad appeal and that are not sexy subjects, and that sounds like a downer, and that sounds controversial or whatever, those are the ones they'd rather not bother with. And so that's the role that we have as film festivals, is to create a place where artistically, emotionally, intellectually, these difficult stories, these challenging things that speak to maybe niche audiences, have a home and have a platform and have support, and that we're not doing it for the purposes of what am I going to make the most profit on. We're doing it for the purposes of what really deserves to be told and shared. And so that's where mission can be antithetical to economics. And so guests tend to manage their own expectations to an extent when they're going to an event in person, and they're reminded of the context of which they're experiencing things. But I think when you have literally, have minutes between binging something on Netflix on this really easy to browse user interface that literally billions of dollars have been poured into, and watching content that, again, literally billions of dollars has been poured into, and then clicking over to this thing that's been put together by this, grassroots community organization, that's there's an elevation gap there. and I think it is on the organizations to try and communicate that, but I think it's also upon us as the guests, as the viewers, as the audience members, as people who support this organization, to also kind of remind ourselves of the context of that. Because I think it's, when you don't have the drive to somewhere, and you don't have the, all of the things that help you establish context, and you're just jumping from one thing to another, it's easy to forget it.
I'm really glad that you brought up this larger topic of the role of film festivals, because everything we've been talking about really points to the fact that we are consistently learning. We're having to consistently figure things out and possibly even step into roles that we previously might not have. And I think the audience is kind of going along with all of us different film festivals on that journey. And so I think this is a good segue point into asking you, Chris, how this year's edition of the Atlanta Film Festival will work. How can audiences view films? What is the breakdown of virtual versus, things that are maybe happening in drive-in or at the plaza? How can people take part in this year?
Yeah. So for us, compared, I'll kind of do 2 reference points. For us, in comparison to last year's festival, and even certainly comparison to a normal year's festival, there's a number of ways that are different. So much like we had in the 2020 Atlanta Film Festival, we're going to have both virtual options and drive-in options. Unlike the 2020 festival, we're also going to have 2 other options, which is our safe indoor at the Plaza Theater, which we've gone through extensive measures to make sure that the Plaza Theater is literally the safest indoor space available to the public. There's a ton of safety measures that you see, a ton of safety measures you don't see, from not only the pod-based seating that's reserved and the concessions and, that orders and things being brought right to your seat, but to like hospital-grade ionization in the air system. Despite what public guidelines are loosening up, we are still adhering to those large strict guidelines, doing temperature checks at the door and masks and all that kind of stuff. So we have a very, very limited footprint of what we normally do, but it's still an expansion from what we had as part of last year's festival. And then the fourth mode is not really festival wide, but it's something we're very excited about, which is we're going to be doing the world premiere of this incredible documentary called Carterland, made by some filmmakers that are Georgia based. And not only is this the world premiere of the film, and we have a chance to feature these filmmakers' work, but it's their directorial debut, which is also an exciting component as well. But we're going to be able to do this at the Carter Presidential Center, which is a big treat. They are not open. So the Carter Presidential Center has not had guests on property for the better part of a year. And so this is a treat. And we're only going to be able to do this because we're doing it on the lawn there near the reflecting pool of the Carter Center. And so this is going to be a rare opportunity and a rare viewing experience. And this is an incredible film too. And while people are watching it, they will end up realizing how kind of perfect of a viewing mode, not only watching it there at the Carter Presidential Center, but especially, this doesn't give too much away, but especially with how much it underlines the amount of conservation work and work for the environment that President Carter did in office. Watching that film under the stars will really be something special.
I think something else, first of all, I should say that is amazing. I've been to the Carter Center just once in my few years living here in Atlanta, and it's an amazing space. What a cool opportunity. I think viewers, are going to be really excited as film festivals such as yours really have to start thinking outside the box and communicating all of these safety measures and just providing different experiences from what they're maybe even used to. I think, as you said, necessity is leading so much of what your festival and other festivals are doing, but I think it's also forcing us all to be particularly creative, and new opportunities are kind of growing from that, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And, for us, something that's always been true is we work just as hard on choosing the films. I mean, the Atlanta Film Festival is pretty competitively programmed. We had this year, we have about 170 works that we're going to feature. That were chosen from over 9,400 submissions. And so that if you just from a ratio standpoint, that's a pretty competitive process. So not only do we work really hard on narrowing that down and then also in scouring, the possibilities for some of our marquee based programming, but we really believe that, where we show films is also a really vital, important part of what as well as what we're showing in terms of the experience. And so, it's why we've, always done things like, trying to show films at places like the Plaza Theater and the Rialto Center or, Dad's Garage, places that are so not even cinemas necessarily, but, are these important cultural places and done these drive-ins and, doing things like at Pullman Yard or the Goat Farm or, all these different places, because the idea is it should create a sense of occasion, of experience. It should be transformational. And it's not just about what's on screen or who's in the room, but also like what room you're in should add to that experience. And that if you're, someone coming from out of town or you're a local, you feel like a tourist and you feel like everything is really cool. And there's a sense of discovery, not just of the films or the artists, but also of the places.
I want to wrap us up by asking you to get out your crystal ball a little bit. I think one of the things that you mentioned about Atlanta Film Festival, which is true, is that it has a history of working in non-traditional spaces and not really being, not limiting itself to commercial theater spaces. But I think the reality is most film festivals are largely taking place in commercial theater spaces, and it's a really scary moment for a lot of film festivals. It's a very scary moment for a lot of commercial theaters. I'm curious what you think the commercial theater landscape's going to look like in the next 6 months, 12 months, couple of years. I mean, you own the Plaza, so you have a particularly informed view about this. How's it going to go?
I think it's going to be pretty disruptive. So, I mean, aside from COVID, you also have the dismantling of the Paramount Decree that made it illegal since 1948 for studios to own movie theaters. You've also had over the last few decades a consolidation of movie theaters where now 50% of all screens in the country are owned by less than a handful of companies that are also in a really vulnerable state, which makes them, ripe for the buying. So I think, we're going to see a lot of change and transformation. There's probably going to be less movie theater screens nationwide, frankly. And at the same time, they're probably going to be owned by fewer and fewer companies. At the same time, I think there's a special opportunity for operators or exhibitors that are looking to do things very different, very responsive to their community's interests, and not on a nationwide, all locations, all this at the same time, for them to kind of carve out a special space. And I would like to be optimistic and think that there could be, in some ways, a renaissance, at least of the neighborhood-owned theaters. Kind of like, what we sort of saw in restaurants, where now we have a rich offering of locally owned, chef-run mom and pop places. But, we were heading down a path where everything was going to be an Olive Garden or an Applebee's. And that's kind of what our movie theater offerings have become. And so on one hand, I think there's going to be a lot of change. On another hand, I have to be optimistic that at least for a place like the Plaza Theater and for organizations like the Atlanta Film Society and the Atlanta Jewish Film Festival, that there is a brighter future ahead, as long as we continue to respond and as long as we continue to respond to our communities and we continue to have the support of those communities.
I think that is a perfectly hopeful and exciting place to end our conversation today. Chris, thank you so much again for taking the time to chat with us. We're all very excited for the Atlanta Film Festival.
Thank you.
As always, I am Sarah Glassberg.
And I'm Brad Pilcher.
Producing and editing the show is our technical director, Chris Holland.
The music you're hearing now and earlier in the show is by the incomparable Joe Alterman. You should look him up wherever you get your music.
Thank you once again to our special guest, Chris Escobar. You can find out more information about this year's Atlanta Film Festival at atlantafilmfestival.com. Our show notes for this episode, as always, are at ajff.org/inconversation.
Our email address is inconversation@ajff.org. Drop us a question or comment. You just might find yourself in a future episode.
Don't forget to subscribe in your podcast app of choice or check out our YouTube channel for new episodes. Give us a rating or a review. It all helps.
What helps, maybe most of all, is your financial support. We can only continue to do this podcast and our other digital programs with the ongoing support of listeners like you. If you're able to, please make a donation at ajff.org.
And don't forget to tell all your friends about the show. Until next time, goodbye.